You're live.
Hi everyone, welcome to tonight's MHTV. We've got another great evening tonight with Steve Trenchard, our guest tonight, talking about trauma-informed nursing and compassionate cultures. Nicky's going to be covering the social media, so I'll just go over to Nicky first to let her tell you how you can join in tonight.
Absolutely. So we're watching out on Facebook. So if you want to ask any questions at all, please post them in and we'll pass them back. And if you are following along on X, formerly known as Twitter, I still can't get used to it and I still don't like it. So join me with that. Just follow the hashtag MHTV and we'll absolutely include your points of view. We'd love to hear from you. Back to Vanessa.
Lovely. Okay, so Steve, I'm very jealous of the background. That I'm assuming that that's a fake background and not your actual garden. It's can't hear you. You've gone. Can you hear? I think we've lost your voice, haven't we?
I can hear you, but I can't hear Steve.
No, I can't. Oh, well. Can't hear him, can we?
Yeah, you've got a disembodied voice coming onto the episode. Now, Steve, I don't know what's gone wrong with your audio, but it's still showing that you should be connected. So it might be best if you just go off Zoom and then come back onto the room and let's see if that solves the problem.
We've had worse disasters to deal with, haven't we? So we'll manage it. We'll take it in our stride.
Constantly. This is mental health for you people. Don't even worry about it.
Exactly.
There's all sorts of things we're thinking that we would like to be able to talk to Steve about. Obviously, he's had a long and distinguished career. As he connects back to the audio, we wanted to talk a little bit about career and leadership and maybe trauma-informed care. You there, Steve?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Brilliant. Yeah. Great.
Back to Vanessa.
Yeah. Welcome back.
Thank you. Quick prelude, just put the grass behind me.
Yeah. Lovely. So we were just saying while you were just sorting your audio out that one of the things that's interesting about tonight's conversation, I guess, is that you've had a really long and notable career, haven't you, in mental health, covering roles in, director of nursing post, chief executive, academic roles as professor of mental health nursing. So I guess in your career, interested in maybe starting with some reflections really about those years. How have things changed? Have they improved?
Oh, thank you. And it's great being here talking to you guys. I think undoubtedly there have been some things that have improved and some things that haven't. So if we think about the lessons that we can learn from history, let's go back a couple of 100 years. So I had the pleasure and some of the challenges of working at one of the oldest charities in the land, which was the Retreat at York, which was developed on the back of a woman who had been abused at the local York asylum, who, when she was admitted from a Quaker background, she was within 3 months dead, a woman called Hannah Mills. And the Quakers collectively, they wanted to develop a new model of humane-centered care. If we cycle forward and go into the early 20th century, 1900s, we've got the Hanwell Asylum with John Connolly, who was one of the medical superintendents that tried to challenge at that point, the evidence-based approach to putting people through water baths and stinging them from the ceiling and spinning them around in nets, all that stuff. He was eventually discharged and disbarred because he was too seen to be too forward-thinking. And then if we go to the work of the 60s with Goffman and Barton, and then more latterly we've got Winterbourne and the recent case of Greater Manchester in the forensic service. So I think they have at an individual level and a therapy level, I think things haven't changed, but things have improved. But there are still, the potent energy in psychiatric hospitals and mental health institutions means that things can quickly go wrong. And maybe in a bit talk on that piece about compassionate leadership and the need for a constant focus on culture, how we do things around here. And there's something in that whole piece about how we look after one another, how we're compassionate to ourselves, and more than kindness, more than being empathic, but that whole compassionate piece. And when I Derbyshire Healthcare NHS Foundation Trust, prior to starting as its chief executive, I did a 3-day workshop with Professor Paul Gilbert to understand his thinking around compassion from an evolutionary perspective, and the way he had developed his CBT model for understanding shame and understanding depression and understanding compassion as a model. And I don't think we've really got to grips with that as a profession in terms of really understanding inhibitors and the protective factors that stop us from leaning in and being really close and attentive to people. And it's understandable services are so busy. But yeah, so I think there are some good things. I think the evidence-based around psychosocial interventions in the 2000s was fantastic at challenging and tackling the poor outcomes for people with serious mental health problems such as psychosis. I think all of the work around challenging our understanding of attachment disorders that we still call personality disorders, that we really need to rename, are important. I think we've come some way in terms of having a stronger social political voice as a profession, but there's still some way to go. I think that there's great opportunities in research around co-production, and really, if we take Hearing Voices as an example, my other 4-day training before being the chief exec was to do some focused work with Marius Rom and the Hearing Voices Network, looked at the Maastricht interview. And that was just fantastic. What a great trauma-informed model for understanding how voices are heard and understood by people, rather than falling into you're hearing voices, therefore you got psychosis, therefore you need meds. I am simplifying that process, but it still happens. I've got a friend who's in now, to really understanding what do these voices mean and how do they link to your possible trauma history, or even your history of you, and how so I think there is still much to do, but there are some definitely things to be proud about and to congratulate ourselves.
I think it's interesting, the Hearing Voices movement, because I think, Nicky, we probably started our careers at a fairly similar period, but in the early 90s, certainly when I trained, it was very much that you were told don't talk to people about their voices because it's glued in with people. And we've really moved on from that, haven't we, now, to kind of really engaging with people, helping people to understand, and thinking about people that I've supported in my career, also people who sometimes have positive voices, and people who talk about feeling lonely when the voices have gone. So voices are not always negative, are they, either? So I think we have moved on quite a lot in our understanding. And it was interesting what you were saying about the history of nursing, because I often reflect on that. And I think mental health, more than any other branch of nursing, has a whole history around power and coercion, doesn't it? So I think that that for me really links into why it's so important now that as part of our identity, we are very much about, giving a voice to other people. And I think where the trauma-informed work is so important, isn't it, around psychological safety and trust, and working with people rather than doing things to people, and certainly restrictive practice, which is still very much around, I think, although more covert probably than it used to be. So yeah, I would agree with you. It's quite mixed, really, isn't it? We have moved forwards, but in some ways I think we've got a lot to do still. And also your comment about compassion, I think, is really important, because again, if we're talking about history, when I reflect back, I became a nurse in an era when we didn't talk about our own mental health. And it was almost as though you're a nurse now, so you have a perfect family. You don't have anyone who's ever experienced any mental health difficulties. You've never experienced any mental health difficulties, and you're just going to be caring for people who've experienced that, which of course was absolute nonsense. And I think we have definitely shifted somewhat in that people are starting to talk more openly about their own mental health difficulties. And I think as part of that, we're kind of starting to acknowledge well-being more and compassion. But again, I think it is complex because we still see a lot of burnout, don't we, in mental health nursing, I think. And I don't think people always realise, possibly until they move to a different area often, that they were burnt out during a period of practice, I think.
And I think one of the fantastic developments is around peer support and
Yeah, I do.
lived experience, not just of people who become peer support workers or lived experience practitioners, but also of nurses that are supported to be very open about their own lived experience. As a student working at Tudor Lloyd Hospital many moons ago, there was a particular ward that was for professionals only, and it was for medical, nursing professions from each of the different families, people from religious backgrounds we had. It was a very specific and specialist unit, and most people worked on the assumption that you wouldn't work after this. So that pessimism associated with mental health, I think, one of the things that has really improved in terms of the openness that we have around mental health. But I think there's also some difficulties with that as well. We live in going back to the political stuff, we live in a neoliberal community, and where actually we still place the blame of illness or poor health on individuals and miss association with what political decisions are making. Where we've learned a lot from COVID, but we had some of the worst outcomes in the world from COVID because of austerity.
Yeah.
That is a political decision. We've got fewer mental health nurses because of austerity. We've got fewer beds per 100,000 because of austerity, all because of political decisions that are taken. And of course, when you're working at the front end of care, you need your leaders, and they have to be political leaders as well as chief executives and directors, others, articulating the reason why people still keep flowing into services despite a plethora of other services that might be around.
Yeah.
Take children's mental health. I mean, in the last year, I've been working and set up a new hospital, and we set up a new trauma-informed model. We called it the STEP model. So STEP was like the three legs of a stool. So first step was how we you. The second one is how we work to help you recover. And the third one was what you should experience and how you get better with us. So, systematic systems approach, trauma-informed approaches, emotional eating disorders in young people, and positive behavioural support are all good evidence-based interventions that our NMC says and our code says that we should be aware of and be able to have those skills in those areas. The second step was around, providing structured care, providing trustworthy care. So everything we do is in the public domain. We have to demonstrate we're constantly trustworthy. For young people in services that have been traumatized, they're looking to show that you are going to be non-trustworthy, like everybody else in their life has been. Empowering in with the work that we do, and absolutely person-centered. And the person-centeredness, I think, often is misunderstood. It's about the use of language for that person. It's understanding their particular story and life events and how they like stuff. So it's really at focus. And then the third, model in the STEP model is about the first thing you should feel as soon as you step through our door, and in fact begin to think about us, is safe. And you mentioned this psychological. So safe in our services has to be the number one. And there has to be a whole heap of work on what that means for the individual, because, safety is very different for everybody. And then we've got therapeutic, we have to be empowering, and we want young people to make progress in their services. So that was a great attempt at bringing together a lot of experience from a very experienced MDT to think about a new trauma-informed pathway for young people with eating disorders and complex needs. So I think there are some good examples out there. But you know, if I think about NHS and culture, I struggle to see real examples. Not only do we still not capture at board level how many people are covering our services, apart from the IAP measures, we still don't know that.
Yeah, I agree with that.
They're instantly covered. We don't know. We don't capture it. And any measures of compassion in leadership. And you know, there are some really interesting ways that you can cultivate compassion at boards and then help it to feed down. The ways in which you can do that. So
Yeah.
I think still things that we talk about that we probably need to be a bit more braver in terms of enacting. That's one. And one of the first things is about calling out poor behaviour, of course.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess that is very true, that we need to think about compassion as being far more than just providing that kind of care in response to somebody, but also thinking about compassion in leadership, people being able to speak out about poor practice and feel that they're psychologically safe to do that and able to speak out and will be supported.
Yeah, one of the key in Paul Gilbert's model, one of the key elements of a compassionate framework is courage.
Yeah.
So actually taking difficult decisions and doing, as you've suggested, speaking out about stuff is compassion itself.
Yeah,
but it's
exactly.
about courage to do that. And people often don't, because of the sense of toxicity or fear that sits in some services. And there are small things I think around compassion. You know, one of the things I've done with boards is to, you know, go out on visits and get teams to present. But you're always asking, how's it been in the last year, and how have you managed your resilience? How have you worked with each other as a team? And the stories you hear are fantastic. You know, Steve was unwell, so the team clubbed together and took him his casseroles for a week and baked him cakes and picked his kids up and did that sort of stuff. So it's happening in organisations. We don't always capture it. So, you know, seeing how we do that, I think, is really, really, really important for boards.
Yeah. Nicky, did you want to come in at this point?
Yeah, I'm starting to get questions through.
Brilliant.
Asking about compassionate leadership. There seems to be a couple here wanting to understand that concept a little bit more. I won't necessarily read them out because it's suggesting their management hasn't always been that compassionate, but perhaps Steve, you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I had the great opportunity to work with Professor Paul Gilbert, who was at Derby, and interestingly enough, he struggled to really get compassion into all of his services in Derbyshire healthcare. He was doing more than internal, and one of the first things that we did was there was a key message, which is, if you want to develop compassionate models, it has to be from the ground upwards. You can't top down. Got to be from the ground upwards. So you've got to hear, listen, be visible, be present, understand the culture and what's going on in an organization. We often talk about culture as though it's one thing, but of course, in an organization, you've got as many cultures as there are teams. And in a great piece of work that was done at Ashworth Hospital, then named Park Lane Hospital, when I was a student, and on there you had a 3-system shift pattern: early mornings, lates, and nights. And you would have very specific cultures dependent upon who was leading the team. And there was a great chap called Professor Joel Richmond that did a piece of what was happening on the ground. It comes back to my point about leadership, particularly team manager, you know, clinical leadership is absolutely crucial. I don't think we do enough to develop that tier of leadership. So Michael West has done some work more latterly, distinguished professor in organizational development and leadership. He's done some work on compassion. So take the model of compassion. It's you know, the definition of compassion is about noticing distress and having the motivation to act upon it. So it takes skills. Vanessa, you could be walking down the river and it's running very quickly and you slip and fall in and think, oh my God, Vanessa's there. Before I know it, I'm jumped in the water, but I can't swim. So I might feel best. Actually, I haven't got the skills to deal with it. So there's some teaching people the skills in being able to work compassionately, and the person in care experiences that compassionate intent. Let's not forget that the evidence base around most of the therapies, DBT, CBT, counselling, supportive psychotherapies, one of the key consistent issues is the way in which the person experiences the relationship. So Peplau, Hildegard
Yeah.
Peplau is a here because the importance of that therapeutic relationship is absolutely critical in mental health nursing.
Great.
It is the most powerful tool you have. As well as your knowledge and attitudes, it's the most powerful tool you have to be able to work with people. So for me, compassionate leadership it's about visibility. It's about a willingness to hear the very difficult things that go on. We heard this week, didn't we, with the very, very tragic cases of the nurse that's just been charged with multiple murders of young babies. That nurses and others didn't listen. It's rekindled the debate on whether nurses need to be registered and managed. So there's something in there about, I think that the view that came through from the report into mid-staffs was, let's not be surprised when things go wrong. Don Warwick's work, you've got to be very, the possibility that things are going on under your very nose now. And being open and willing to hear that from people. So I still hear of many people who are on national courses like the leadership courses and things who are going into those spaces and are in tears for the first several days because of the level of stress and distress that they experience at work. And that can't be right. That has to be shifted.
Yeah, no, definitely. I do think it links to what we were saying earlier as well about othering people as well. So I think that although it's more subtle now, there is a sense, I think, that we still place people in a different sort of category to us within mental health. And the other thing I think, and I've heard clinicians say this as well, people are exposed to so much trauma within mental health work often that sometimes it can reach a stage where it becomes too painful for people to listen and to be compassionate, and that's when you see people start to distance themselves almost as a sort of safety mechanism, I guess, really psychological safety mechanism. So I think
more than psychological, I think I completely agree. I think we have to understand that we have a very, very old brain and a very new brain. So when I'm talking old, I'm talking millions of years, and new, I'm talking several thousands of years. In terms of, so if I'm threatened, my amygdala is going to be firing all over the place, and it's going to be sending very powerful messages to my vagus nerve, through my vagus nerve to my gut, that's telling me to be on hyper alert and look around. And it's very difficult to be compassionate and to lean in and to work with when you are under threat yourself. And that goes to managers. It goes from the focus on performance management and performance systems. It goes on the focus from checking numbers and data sheets and performance cards. It goes, it's triggered by things like CQC experiences. And there's a paper in waiting that I'm still cogitating over about adverse leadership experiences. So we have adverse childhood experiences. We also have adverse leadership experiences. Things will go, but what we don't do is we don't learn from them. I had experiences of being bullied as a chief exec, and there was a whole series of incidents that I was not expecting within 3 months of me starting to have happened. Fast forward, left me leaving. Now this is 10 years ago. I still get loops over how on earth did that happen? What went wrong? How did it? Where did it go to? It led to a referral to the NMC, who completely cleared me of any wrongdoing. External investigation cleared me of any wrongdoing, but I'd been incredibly traumatized by that experience. And lots of examples of senior leaders and middle leaders who will find themselves in situations where they just suddenly go, wow, what just happened? And then if we had a really compassionate culture, we would say these things will happen, and we now got someone with a whole heap of experiences who can help others with these sorts of experiences. But we move on and we brush it under the carpet and we let it lie. And I think that's a real shame, because we are missing out on all of that richness of lots of experience people have. And when, as a collective, how are we then learning? I don't think we're learning effectively in that place.
And we're not really practicing what we preach, are we? Because we're encouraging clinicians on the ground to be open and reflective and, psychological in their thinking. And then at a senior level, we're saying, let's not talk about any of that. Let's brush it under the carpet. Also seems very male as well, very sort of paternalistic approach to leadership, doesn't it, as well? Yeah, exactly. Very.
I remember when I was working at West London Mental Health Trust, I was a chief nurse there, and I'd done some work with Marius and Pete Rom, Marius Rom and Pete Bullimore previously. And what I was noticing was that through our serious incident reports, people didn't have a good grasp on how to work with psychosis. I don't mean in a psychosocial managed process way, but just think creatively out of the box on how you understand unusual experiences that people come into services with. And more importantly, we had a large contingent in West London of people who had come from, as refugees, from really tricky, dangerous war zones. And we had a couple of incidents where, in my reading of the report, it was clear that people had been heavily traumatized and were being re-triggered by what we were doing in the services. Really seen it was, we need to give more medication and stop the clozapine, and that's why we missed this opportunity, and sadly the person died. And so anyway, I circulated a lot of the grey literature around the Hearing Voices Network, including the BPS report on understanding psychosis, the first report, and I had a message back from the then clinical director, who was the sort of chief medical director for Broadmoor, saying, "Is this for real?" And I remember a long conversation with my then deputy director nurse, and I said, it's okay. This is a view, and we need to see what the culture is saying about it. So it was really interesting. Over the weekend, there were lots of other then discussions with other doctors and other senior nurses. And we did the training, we did the master training. And a couple of months later, I was in the therapy centre in Broadmoor, and there was a guy one of the nurses had gone back and started working with the voices they heard. And he said, if someone had done this when I was on my first acute admission, I wouldn't have gone on the pathway to low, medium, high secure services. I understand, and now I understand my journey. And one of the simple things that we used to do in psychosocial intervention training was a timeline that sort of told, who are you and what's your story? And who are you and what's your story in relation to mental health? And who are you and what's your story in relation to adversity? And it's really interesting. Lens at which you look through will give you a really different view on that person's perspective. And again, I remember a fantastic OT who worked in Leeds, had been working with someone in their 30s and went back to the childhood experiences, and they'd lost one of their grandparents, very, very important person to him when he was 16, started to hear the grandparents' voice, started smelling some things that, and I've had this experience myself. My granddad died. I could smell his pipe. I have quite a broad framework for understanding sort of, spiritual frameworks and things. And I was quite comforted by the idea that my granddad was following me around smoking his pipe. This phenomenon was uncovered, and the guy within 12 months was off his antipsychotic medication and back in employment and making a full recovery. He sort of managed to step away from this identity of someone with schizophrenia into someone who a trauma, early age, and dealt with it, and now
define him, forever.
So I think there's something about trauma-informed approaches don't have to be super fancy. They require a way of thinking about people's experiences and what that means in terms of attachment, resilience, shame, really important one.
Yeah.
Social networks, really important one, but also recognizing that, you know, the public health data around adverse childhood experiences, they have a dose effect. So if you're exposed to 3, 4, 5 of those, you are incredibly more, you have a greater latent vulnerability. Think about the stress vulnerability model. You have a greater latent vulnerability to experience the conditions that we call, or the experiences that we call mental illness. So it goes back to think to that sort of, how do we understand people's experiences? What's the model that we use?
Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it, how kindness kind of underpins all of this, like compassion and empathy, and things that you would think that we would be better at than we seem to be as a whole. And Dave's drawn my attention to a new GMC document, and it has treating colleagues with kindness, courtesy, and respect. And that seems to have unleashed a bit of a we can't say twit storm anymore, an X storm. There's been a mention of kindness, and some doctors and commentators are pushing back against kindness being included in the new GMC document, Good Medical Practice. The commentary, some of the comments are things like, in the current climate, post serial killer, broader NHS chaos, their proposed new duty of be kind is particularly crass bit of simpering. So where do you think this anger is coming from? What's the meaning of it, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's probably multi-layered. I think the kindness piece is misunderstood. So it was a bit like the post-Francis report. Of course, we want kindness, but kindness is different to compassion. So I would prefer compassion always to be used over kindness. But I think if you look at the book by Penelope Campling and Jonathan Hallett around intelligent kindness, it's called Intelligent Kindness. It came out somewhere around 2012, I think. A brilliant expose, so it's a psychodynamic view of organizations and how the nurse or a team can be at the center of an organization. What you want is an organization that's based on sense of community and a sense of kinship, a sense of knowing. If you get an organization that's based more on chasing numbers, chasing targets, people will become anxious, become distressed, will dissociate, and care will become brutal. And that's the piece I said about don't be surprised when we have serious incidents and organizational failure. Not as a let's not be surprised and be complacent, but let's really understand the way in which our healthcare organizations have the propensity, as shown over a few hundred years, to be brutal and brutalizing places. I think the thing is that the work on education for doctors and also for nurses shows that the process of education in itself can be a bit brutalizing and cannot really live up to the values. And it used to really upset me when we'd have fantastic nurses that would graduate after 4 years at Leeds Met and within 6 months had left the profession to become drug reps or, you know, work in a corner shop, because there was something about the culture that they entered, just it wasn't what they expected. And there's often a disconnect between the values that we have as individuals and then the values that we believe the organization to have. And that comes down to that psychological contract and that psychological safety piece. I also think doctors, as one of our lead professions, are cross and angry with austerity. They're cross and angry with the pay deal. They're cross and angry with the number of people that died. They're cross with some parts of the public because the hand clapping really didn't go as far as it needed to, or as far as it could have done, should I say. They're cross with, you know, politicians who flouted the rules that they themselves followed, and all of us followed, I think, pretty diligently. So I think there is an unrest that's about. And so I'm surprised by that storm that's come from that.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's almost like kindness can be seen as oppressive in some ways, that, you know, you've just got to kind of be kind and carry on kind of thing. And I think that is where some of the backlash is around that, you know, nurses have been kind, nurses have been caring, but actually the sort of damage to nurses and actually we've had previous episodes, haven't we, talking about moral injury as well, particularly during COVID, I think. And I think that links very much to the, debate on compassion, really, because if people are exposed to, moral injury and psychological trauma over and over again, and they feel that they're not being supported, then of course, people are not going to be compassionate, because it's a self-protective mechanism, isn't it? But then again, what happens is then nurses will be further punished for being burnt out and not being compassionate, rather than actually looking at the systemic reasons that that have led to that, really. Which goes back to what you were saying about leadership, really.
Well, I was doing a little bit of reading and watching stuff around, and there's a great link on. I must congratulate Liverpool CAMS service. Liverpool CAMS service has got some stuff on adverse childhood experiences, and there's a spoken word piece that starts at the beginning of it, and they mention compassion. They say, seeing, so this is from the views of a young child, seeing genuine compassion given unselfishly, giving hope by an adult to help me be me. And I was thinking, the whole evidence base around a regular adult in a young person's life, particularly one who ends up in the care system, has shown to be an incredibly potent protective factor. Well, I think there are other potent factors that can carry on, because actually you don't stop losing your trauma just when you become an adult, when you turn 18. It carries on. It can be re-triggered. So my trauma of being bullied at school was re-triggered massively when I had the shame of being associated with the bad behaviour of a bullying chairman. Massively.
Yeah.
I think about actually helping people, and this comes back to the educational piece for all the professional groups, but helping us understand our reasons for coming into the profession, the things that we're proud about and the things that we want to take with us through our profession. But also, I think there's a challenge here. So seeing genuine compassion given unselfishly gives hope by an adult to help me be me. I think nurses need help at all levels, from leaders, from colleagues, to help them be them, to help me be me. So there's something about what does that team look like? So if we begin to pull out bits of research, so Lambauer's research on Safe Awards, brilliant stuff.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah.
The nurse team at the beginning of the shift, recognizing they've had a bad night before, recognizing they're worried about a particular person, shouts at them and they find it difficult, they found it abusive, so on. It's like, helping them. The senior matron that comes on, or the clinical lead that comes on, the support that they offer in order to help that team be the best they can be, then up to the next level, and so on and so forth. When we used to invite people, when I used to invite our teams to our boards, we used to do a regular, I used to say, look, the things that keep you awake at night are the things that keep me awake as a director, nurse, and a chief exec, because you're worried about patient care, as am I. You're worried about people and recruitment, as am I. You're worried about your finances, as am I. But I never put finances at the foreground. That was always in the background. So, it's a shared endeavour. It's about healthcare. It's about positivity and hopefully, recovery-based experiences for people. But so I think there's something about how do we cultivate communities of leadership in organisations where people know to go and talk freely about stuff. Schwarzrand is a great example of where that's been attempted. Needs to be more routinized in the way in which the organisation itself is set up.
Yeah. That's about leaders being visible, though, isn't it, as well, I think, and accessible, because, I think there's often still a kind of hierarchical mindset. So I've always loved, communities of practice as a methodology for, handing back, to the people who've got the expertise, really, the clinicians, and letting them, find solutions to sort of intractable problems, because often that doesn't happen. I think there's a bit of a hierarchical mindset. So we think, of course, talk to a leader, But actually, if you're a newly qualified nurse, you're not necessarily going to have the confidence to go and talk to a senior leader, because what you've learned is that you're not allowed to go and talk to somebody more senior. You need to talk to your own leader first, and then often issues are quashed, aren't they, at that level? So it's I think it's very difficult, isn't it, for people
social as a change approach. Social movements, I think, are really interesting.
Yeah.
Back in the day when early intervention services were just a twinkle in the policy implementation guidelines eye, we use social movement methodology to bring people together and cultivate their own practice, their own outcomes, their own work, their own programs of activity. It wasn't centralized. We came on a few monthly basis, but we provided some structure, and we sort of said, look, the ground's a bit like, where you're working, we're going to put some sunlight on it, and we're going to put a little bubble around, cultivate it. The cultivation was through people's passion.
Definitely.
From the top down, as a member of NIME at the time, I didn't say you must do this by when, and this is your Gantt chart, please follow it, which is a lot of what transformation now is about. It was, okay, where do you want to go with this, and how do you see it? Here's the evidence base. How is this going to work for your community? How does this work for your population? What data do you need to do that? So a really bottom-up, grounded approach, I think, is much, much healthier than top-down stuff.
I quite agree. Yeah.
Most top-down transformation fails abysmally and spends millions of pounds.
Yeah. Yeah, for all the reasons that we just talked about, really.
Yeah.
Because we're asking people to do things in kind of with very limited resources. We need to win people's hearts and minds over, don't we? People need to be connected to the issue and the purpose of what they're doing. And I think by not engaging people in any transformation, that's where it tends to go wrong. So I think engagement is often seen as we haven't got time to do the engagement. We need to move straight into what's the new model we're developing, when are we going to deliver it? But actually, I've always thought, if you spend that time on engagement and building relationships, then you're going to have a more sustainable model in the long run. So yeah.
Absolutely. Guys, I'm just looking at the time. We've covered career leadership, trauma-informed care, compassionate cultures, learning from history, evidence-based and mental health nursing, ACEs, models for distress, hearing voices. And I think maybe we need to take a breather. We've worked through some really major issues. I've been really interested as well about thinking about kind of kindness and how it can be quite triggering for people, how it can make people really angry when it's offered as the only solution to stuff that's systemic. And I think you both made that point really well. I guess we need to start thinking about if there's anything that we want to say before we finish up tonight. Vanessa, is anything from you?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that I was just thinking about what we can celebrate, because we've talked quite critically, haven't we? But I think what I feel at the moment is that there is a bit of a shift in, like the Mental Health Deserves Better campaign, the sort of relational manifesto. I don't know if you've seen that, the Royal College of Psychiatrists are promoting. So I do think there's a bit of a sea change at the minute, where there is a group of us who are kind of thinking about actually what's mental health nursing about, and kind of trying to refocus ourselves on the therapeutic relationship and what's unique about mental health nursing. The thing about mental health nurses that I think is positive is that we do tend to kind of come together over issues, and I think on the whole we generally have quite strong identities in terms of what we think mental health nurses are about. So I think on a positive, it's been good to see the way the mental health community has started to come together a little bit recently to kind of try and reclaim back some of what mental health nursing is about. So that's my reflection.
Steve?
I think there's something about wherever you are, whatever level in the organization you're working, whether you're a student nurse or whether you're a director nurse, and you have an opportunity to use everyday interactions to demonstrate compassion. So in the number one challenge for IMROC, which is the implementing, recovery and overcoming organizational challenges, the number one is to use those day-to-day interactions to support recovery conversations and demonstrate that you are true. I think the same applies for the way in which we frame our emails, the way in which we talk to people, and particularly the more senior you get, there's something about your non-verbals and your verbal, the language you use, has the one very wise chief exec once sort of described to me that as you become more senior, when you speak, it's a bit like dropping a stone in the mill pond, has a big splash. When you're junior, it's a bit like dropping a stone in an ocean, hardly anyone notices. That's how important your actions become. So I just think there's a great opportunity to really dig into what we understand by compassion and that whole leadership, but more importantly, the practice piece and practice on ourselves. We are our most vulnerable and long-lasting patient for ourselves. I can use that term. So being patient with ourselves and then looking after ourselves is going to mean we're better able to be in the game longer, looking after other people. So I think that would be my
it's a nice note to end on.
While form changes and ICBs change and ICS has changed and stuff, people are people. Haven't really changed. We won't see significant biological changes in our next 1,000 years as a people. We'll see biomechanics and all that sort of stuff happen, but in terms of how we work, the importance of emotionality, I think, is absolutely critical.
Good note to finish on there, I think. Thank you very much, Steve, for your time. I've got loads of things that are buzzing around in my head now that I know I'll be thinking about, so appreciate that. And also lovely to see Vanessa. Dave, I've just spoken to offline, and he hasn't got anything to add. So other than to wish everybody a very good night. Thank you for your time. It's been lovely to have you with us. Good night. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.